You may recall in my early Universal's career, when I took a look at the Unmade Stories of the second Doctor's run to determine whether or not I would have preferred any of them to what we actually ended up getting on screen. Well, as a 60s Who elitist, now I'ma do the same thing for the first Doctor era. Oh yeah, happy 60th anniversary year or something. So, like with the second Doctor series, I'ma split this retrospective up into separate videos for separate seasons, and so naturally this first video will be centered around the Unmade Stories of the show's opening run. Let's get started. We kick things off with the enigmatically titled Nothing at the End of the Lane. It would have been penned by an unsung hero of Doctor Who's creation, C.E. Webber, and when I lay out the broad summary, it should sound pretty familiar. A young student and her two school teachers end up in some old man's time machine. Yeah, it's basically the first draft idea for episode 1 of An Unearthly Child, but with some curious differences. For one, the character of Doctor Who, yes, not the Doctor, Doctor Who, would have been an amnesiac, and his time machine would have been invisible. Program creator Sidney Newman didn't like that latter detail in particular, so it was thrown out. Additionally, all three companions had different names, with Susan being called Biddy, Ian sporting the name Cliff, and Barbara instead having been christened Lola. Yeah, nah, that feels weird to even say here, so I'm glad we got their finalised names. This initial synopsis, I don't know what it is, but to me it comes off more like a one-off experiment rather than something that would actually lend itself to a long-running TV show. It's lacking something. Perhaps a follow-up sequence where the time machine demonstrates its function by taking them to another time or location? Well, Webber clearly thought something similar, as he expanded on his initial premise with an idea called the Giants. On top of having the prior synopsis from Nothing at the End, albeit substituting the invisible ship idea for the police box and renaming Biddy to Sue, the time machine would have ended up transporting the travellers to Cliff's laboratory at the teacher's school and shrinking them to minuscule proportions, where Cliff and Lola would have been menaced by a number of comparatively giant-sized perils, including a caterpillar and a spider, and attempting to communicate with their students through a microscope. Okay then, so in concept it's basically the Planet of Giants beta test. Righto. Script editor David Whittaker apparently approved of the idea, but Sidney Newman was not so impressed, thinking that the narrative wouldn't allow much opportunity for character development. Also, on a production level, there were concerns that this ambitious concept wouldn't be feasible to execute in the tiny recording space of Doctor Who's earliest days, Limegrove Studio D. So in the end, the idea was canned in favour of the more gritty prehistoric tale 100,000 BC, or An Unearthly Child as we know it today. Still, as I said, David Whittaker liked the idea of a shrunken TARDIS team encountering normal-sized perils, so later down the line, with the advent of studio filming shifting to the roomier facilities of BBC Television Centre, he commissioned Louis Marks to finally bring the concept to life, hence Planet of Giants. Obligatory plug for my Louis Marks video. Yeah, I like how things worked out, and I wouldn't have it any other way. Moving on. The next planned story idea was the Masters of Luxor, alternatively entitled The Robots. The time travellers would have arrived on a moon of the planet Luxor, ruled by robots with a leader known as the Perfect One. With its goal to discover the secret of life, it would have taken Barbara and Susan hostage, while Ian and the Doctor would have found its creator to help overthrow it and its robot army. It was initially conceived to be the immediate follow-up to 100,000 BC, not to mention sharing the same script writer. Anthony Coburn's script was allegedly inspired by the increase of computer usage and technological advancements in the television industry, and I do love me some technophobic 60s Who stories, so I guess you could say I'm on board conceptually. Alas, a recommission or two later, which had resulted in the story being extended from 4 completed episode scripts to 6, the production team ended up dropping it from the schedule in favour of this little Terry Nation ditty you may or may not have heard of called the Daylex or something? I don't know. They did consider the Masters of Luxor for a later slot, particularly sometime during Season 2, but ultimately it didn't work out and it was discarded. But not to fear, Big Finish to the rescue. Adapted to the audio medium by Nigel Robinson, it saw William Russell and Carol Ann Ford reprising their roles as Ian and Susan respectively, as well as narrating the actions and dialogue of the Doctor and Barbara, with the other roles, particularly of the Perfect One himself, being portrayed by Joseph Kloska. Now, based on this adaptation, I did enjoy this story quite a lot. The technophobic commentary of whether machine could truly live as man is rich and thick throughout, with the Perfect One and his robots being rigidly logical and failing to comprehend certain human behaviours or even factual events outside of their understanding. The irony, almost tragedy, of how inhumane the Perfect One behaves in his quest to achieve full humanity is a very thought-provoking premise. The adventure also has an element of mystery and suspense in the world building, particularly in the early parts when the TARDIS is drained of all power and the travellers are forced to explore the ominous structure inside which they have arrived. There's some decent character moments dotted throughout for the companions too, with Ian, Barbara and Susan's defiance of the Perfect One's cold selfishness, not to mention the Perfect One's creator Tibor feeling intense disgust and shame over what his scientific experiments had led him to create. Yeah, there's a lot of pondering over the extremes of where science could take us here, again tying into that 60s technophobic theme. That said, there is a pinch of kinda dated gender politics mixed in there as well. Don't worry, it's nowhere near as bad as that other Lost story, but it's certainly still an element that bears consideration. As for whether I'd have liked this story to go ahead in the 60s in place of one of the others that we actually got on screen, I don't know about that. I mean, certainly not as the second story ever as originally intended, as the Daleks was a far more powerful and impactful mission statement for Doctor Who as a whole at the time. But as for somewhere else in Season 1, perhaps? I do think it's a slightly more intelligently constructed story than The Keys of Marinus, with a far more engrossing and cohesive conflict, so maybe it could have that slot, but other than that, I prefer the likes of Marco Polo, the Aztecs, and the Reign of Terror. The jury's out on this one. I really like it, but I'm undecided on whether I like it to that level. The next Lost story idea for Season 1 comes to us in the form of Britain 408 AD, which would have been scripted at the hands of future Pertwee-era writer Malcolm Hulke. Ooh, really? Damn, I love Malcolm Hulke's work! Either way, the adventure would have been set during the Romans' departure from Britain in the 5th century, among clashes between Celts and Saxons, as the Doctor and friends help innocent villagers get to the safety of the TARDIS. Script editor David Whittaker felt that the plot was too complex, with too many opposing factions and a plot resolution that echoed An Unearthly Child too closely, and so he asked Hulke to refine it. However, the production team later decided that they didn't want a surplus of historical adventures in the season, and so it was discarded. Hulke later tried resubmitting the idea for Season 3, but following script editor Dennis Spooner rejected it because, well, we already had a Roman story by that point and we didn't need another one. As much of a Hulke stan I am, I'm not really too fussed about this one's abandonment in favour of the ones that we actually got. Though that said, if this story had gone ahead in Season 1, it apparently would have been directed by Christopher Barry, so that's something. Still, Hulke didn't give up just yet, as he started scripting another story idea for Season 1 with The Hidden Planet. The TARDIS would have landed on an unseen planet of our solar system orbiting on the exact opposite side of the Sun to Earth. Everybody listen! Nope, this isn't solar system lore, this story didn't even get made, shush. The opposite planet shares a lot of similarities to Earth, but with some notable differences, particularly a gender role reversal premise. Barbara would have been kidnapped by rebels because she's the exact doppelganger for the planet's matriarchal leader, while Ian, Susan and the Doctor would have become embroiled in a male suffrage movement. What's with these lost stories and their dated gender commentaries? Well, in any case, it was shifted around in the season lineup a fair bit, from the 7th serial slot back to the 8th serial slot, and then suddenly brought forward to the 5th story of the lineup. However, when Hulk sent in a completed episode 1 script, it was considered unacceptable. Hulk revised the script somewhat, and it hung in there for consideration to be a part of the following season 2, but with the departure of Susan and the lack of marketable alien monsters being of concern to the production team, it didn't make it in. Like with his other story idea, he tried submitting it again for season 3, but it was rejected once more as the concept still involved Ian and Barbara despite them having departed in season 2. Ah well, Malcolm Hulk, I love you man, but your calling came later in the show's life. Another script idea for season 1 was entitled The Living Planet. I swear this is a separate entry from the prior one. To be written by Alan Wakeman, the TARDIS would have arrived on a bizarre, seemingly sentient planet, with strange hexagonal skin cells dotted across the surface, and strange hostile flying fish belonging to its ecosystem. As Susan, or in this brief, Suzanne, becomes trapped underground and Ian goes to rescue her, the planet attempts to absorb the TARDIS. Wakeman wrote an episode 1 script for this intended 4-part serial, but it was rejected for being too sophisticated for the target audience, which to me reads more like, we don't have the budget for this. A couple of additional interesting facts about it, though. It would have utilised a potential backstory for the Doctor and Suzanne developed by Anthony Coburn. Namely that Suzanne was an alien princess and that she and the Doctor were on the run from a race of aliens called Paladins, which the Doctor mistakes the aforementioned flying fish for. Additionally, when the revival was being developed in the mid-2000s, Wakeman allegedly resubmitted his idea to Russell T Davies in the hopes that it would be brought to life in the 21st century, but alas it wasn't to be, and with Wakeman's passing in 2015 it probably never will. Still, it's certainly an ambitious idea that I'd have liked to see developed in some form, although it may have been a bit too much for an early 60s budget. What I envision in my mind's eye is basically the production of the Web Planet, and yeah, the less said about that the better. Moving on. Another idea spitballed for season 1 was a historical tale called The Red Fort, which curiously would have been written by Terry Nation. Interesting. You know, Terry Nation is a pulp 60s sci-fi guy. You can't really envision him writing a historical. You barely count. Either way, the Doctor and friends would have become embroiled in the Indian Mutiny of 1857, presumably focusing around the assault on the location referenced in the title. Nation apparently never really committed to the idea though, as it fell by the wayside once he completed work on the Daleks and began scripting the Keys of Marinus. Still, it's an intriguing premise for a pure historical, and I'm sure Doctor Who could probably do it justice sometime in the future. Maybe it's for the best that it wasn't done in the 60s anyway, considering the outdated portrayals of other ethnicities. Huh. Speaking of historicals though, script editor David Whittaker workshopped the idea of a serial entitled The New Armada. It would have basically had the Doctor and friends hang around in 16th century Spain. Gerald Blake, later to direct The Abominable Snowmen and The Invasion of Time, was scheduled to direct this had it gone into production. However, its slot in the season 1 lineup was ultimately taken up by The Reign of Terror. It was considered for both seasons 2 and 3 as well, but obviously that never happened. I can't really give any perspective on this idea, considering any information I could find about it was so brief, but considering it's David Whittaker at the typewriter, I imagine it would have been cool. I'm not sacrificing any existing story to see it made though. Now we get a real mould breaker in The Fragile Yellow Arc of Fragrance, a script by Turkish writer Morris Fahy. The TARDIS would have arrived on an alien planet, and Barbara's rejection of a man propositioning her for love results in him being condemned to death. Huh, that is certainly a unique idea. Fahy got in touch with David Whittaker about writing for the show, and provided this single episodic serial as an example of his script writing. However, Whittaker rejected it on the grounds of finding the subject matter unsuitable for the programme, but encouraged him to submit other ideas. More on that in a bit. But that wasn't the end for The Fragile Yellow Arc of Fragrance, as in 2010, Big Finish produced an audio adaptation. Nigel Robinson worked his magic converting this tale for our ears, and William Russell and Carol Ann Ford reprised their roles here, accompanied by the acting talents of Helen Goldwyn and even regular Big Finish writer John Dorney. And I must say, this is an intriguing one-off moral dilemma. It feels a lot like something Big Finish themselves would later do for their own short trips range. The life cycle of the species compelling them to find love or die is quite a strong idea, and the ending in particular is quite the gut punch. I can see why Whittaker refused it though, although less because it's inappropriate for the show and more the fact that it's very unconventionally structured for it. Although I imagine the potential televised version would have turned out pretty differently. It would have been cool to have it on screen, but at the same time, I can't really imagine it. But now, farewell Great Macedon, a 6-part pure historical tale also by Maurice Fahey. The first Doctor and companions would have arrived in the Hanging Gardens of Babylon and met Alexander the Great, although they are soon embroiled in, and become framed for, the assassination of his generals and eventually himself. Whittaker suggested that Fahey write a pirate-themed historical, but Fahey ignored him and started writing this Alexander the Great story instead. Chad move. He was so enthusiastic about the premise that he ended up writing a full script for it right off the bat. However, the production team requested extensive rewrites that Fahey was not comfortable with, as he felt they would have compromised the historical integrity of the narrative. So ultimately it was cancelled and left in the dust. But no fear, 46 years later in 2010? Yep, you guessed it. Big Finish swoop in, sensing financial profit from this lost story as a vulture would sense food from a dying antelope. Bit of a dark analogy. The same cast from the prior audio entry perform here too, minus Goldwyn, with Dorney in particular portraying Alexander the Great himself, and dear lord does he bring unending gusto to this role. Nigel Robinson also adapted these scripts as well. As for the story itself, wow. If you're a fan of the months-long storytelling span of a serial like Marco Polo, with the heavy emotional investment into tragic history like the Aztecs, then you'll absolutely adore what this tale has to offer. So few other celebrity historicals have delved this deeply into the psyche of their subject, as Alexander the Great is among the most fleshed out and nuanced depictions that the franchise has ever seen, from his utopian dream of a united world, to his short temper, especially under the influence of alcohol, to his code of honor in times of unrest and impending death. The absolute roller coaster that is his relationship with the Doctor and friends is edge-of-your-seat compelling drama, as is his eventual assassins framing the time travelers for the deaths of his generals and closest friends. There's also some fantastic material for our leads, with Barbara's guilt-felt realization that despite how much she admires Alexander, she knows there's nothing she can do for him and that history must take its course, contrasting with the Doctor who, although knowing and acknowledging the aforementioned unalterable nature of the past, still makes sure to try his best in saving Alexander's life regardless. It's an absolutely beautiful commentary on how far they have come over their travels. And of course, to top it all off, the world building is absolutely rich and gorgeous, as it quite rightly should be for such a slow burn historical outing. Absolutely delicious content. And you know what? Yes, I'd have absolutely loved this story to have gone into production during season 1. As for where though, that's so tricky, as I do really love all the stories that we actually got on screen anyway, and they're a perfect balance of both historical and sci-fi outings to lead the show off with. It's so hard to choose. Maybe in place of the Keys of Marinus? But then you've got 2 slow burn historicals back to back. But they're both so good though! Okay, what about in place of the Censorites? But then you've got 2 tragic historicals together. Oh, this is so hard. And I'm not ditching the Reign of Terror either, that one's dope. Oh, but so's this. But then again, the 60s version wouldn't have John Dorney's performer. I can't decide! I think it's best we wrap this up. The only remaining lost story ideas for season 1 are untitled, pretty underdeveloped, and aren't particularly mind-blowing, so we'll just quickly rapid fire through them. The first 2 were pitched by Robert Gold, Gold? Gould? Gould? The former was basically a resubmission of the same TARDIS crew get shrunk idea that we mentioned earlier, but obviously his version didn't go ahead while Louis Marx's Planet of Giants eventually did, so it is what it is. His other idea involved a planet where vegetable matter ruled the evolutionary chain rather than animal life. It didn't get the green light, but the basic idea did get incorporated as one of the subplots in Terry Nation's The Keys of Marinus, which encouraged accusations of plagiarism from Gould, but it was entirely coincidental. Funny how these things happen. The third Untitled Story idea was submitted by David Fisher, who'd become a recurring writer of the Fourth Doctor era much later down the line. The story would have concerned a spaceship buried under Stonehenge, which is basically the germ of the idea that would eventually turn into his debut story, The Stones of Blood, a decade and a half later. Cool stuff. And finally, another Untitled Story idea submitted by Margot Bennett. What would it have been about, I hear you ask? I dunno. I couldn't find any information about it, outside of it maybe being a historical. Damn. So that wraps up the Unmade Story ideas of Season 1, and most of these I'm pretty ambivalent on, but there are a couple of really strong ones that I'd have loved to have seen on the small screen properly.
Seriously, Farewell Great Macedon is the wet dream of 60 zoo snobs everywhere, and you should all listen to it.
But anyway, catch you next time for Season 2. And 3. Yep, in the same video. Intriguing.